This is question number 7 on the homework 3. This is another question on external funds needed. The optical scan company has forecast a sales growth rate of 25% for next year. Current assets, fixed assets, and short-term debt are proportional to sales, and other items on the balance sheet generally are not proportional to sales. The current financial statements are shown here. So we are given the income statement and the balance sheet. Part A, calculate the external funds needed for next year using the equation from the chapter. So we can find the equation from my PowerPoint lecture slides. So if you go to the lessons on the SciCai website, go to our session 3, and under required regions, just download this PowerPoint lecture slides. And open it. So browse through. The equation is right here. So it's assets divided by sales times delta. This is a Greek letter. This triangle sign is a Greek letter pronounced as delta. Delta generally means the change. So here is the growth in sales minus spontaneous liabilities. So these are the liabilities that change proportional to sales. So in our case, this refers to short-term debt. Short-term debt are proportional to sales. Time divided by sales, and then the change times the change in sales minus the PM, which stands for the profit margin. And we know that that's defined as net income divided by sales. So we can calculate that value based on the income statement. And times projected sales. And we know the current sales, we know the growth rate of sales. We can also calculate the projected sales, which is the current sales times 1 plus the growth rate times 1 minus D. D here is the dividend payout ratio. So even though it's not directly given, but we can calculate that based on the income statement. Because the dividend payout ratio is simply the dividend divided by net income. So we have the number for dividend, we have the number for net income. So we can also calculate this D here. All right, so that means we have sort of every number that's available or which can be calculated to figure out this EFN based on this equation. So now let me start to work on this. So EFN that equals going back to the equation is assets divided by sales. So where do we find assets? That's from the balance sheet, right? So we can just copy this number to our Excel sheet. But remember, you need to get rid of the comma because Excel doesn't recognize that. Divided by assets or divided by sales. Similarly, we can copy this and paste it and get rid of the comma. All right, so times the change in sales. The change in sales, we know that the sales growth rate of sales is 25%, and the current sales is this number. So that means the change in sales has to be the current sales times the growth rate, right? So we can just copy this number. Times 25%. And then minus, go on this equation, minus spontaneous liabilities. That's the short-term debt. So again, just copy it and paste it. Get rid of the comma. And then divided by sales, copy this number here and then times the growth rate, the growth in sales, which is the current sales times the growth rate. And then go on with the equation, that's the profit margin. And we mentioned that we can calculate that value based on the net income divided by sales. So copy that net income number, get rid of the comma, and then sales divided by sales, and times the projected sales. The projected sales. And the projected sales is simply the current sales times 1 plus the growth rate of sales, right? And then times the final number on this equation is 1 minus the dividend payout ratio. So the dividend payout ratio, as we said, is simply the dividend divided by net income. Dividend divided by net income. So net income is right here. So we can just now we can figure out this EFN is 2,197,794. So just put that number into this 2,197,794. And let me check my answer so far. Okay, good. So go back. Part B1, prepare the firm's pro forma balance sheet for next year. So the key to prepare the pro forma balance sheet is to understand that some items on the balance sheet are proportional to sales. So as long as we know the projected sales, with that proportion, we can figure out the projected items on the balance sheet. But other items on the balance sheet are not proportional to sales. And specifically, current assets, fixed assets, and short-term debt, they are proportional to sales. But long-term debt and common stock and accumulated retained earnings, they are not proportional to sales. And for the long-term debt and common stock, without additional information, we actually don't know what happens to these two numbers. Because this external financing needed, as we just calculated from part B, means that in order to maintain this 25% growth rate of sales, the firm actually needs to issue some more funds. How much more? This more, 2,197,794 has to issue. But in what form, we don't know. That depends on the financial policy. So some firm will choose to issue the whole EFN by debt. So that means the long-term debt will increase by this amount. But some other firms, they may choose to issue this new, to finance this new funds by common stock. So that means the common stock will increase by this amount. But other firms, they may have a mix of debt and stock. So both long-term debt and the common stock will increase. So that depends on the financial policy of the firm. As of now, in order to prepare for the pro forma balance sheet, we just keep the current number for the long-term debt and common stock and put those numbers into the pro forma balance sheet. But for the accumulated retained earnings, it's not like these two numbers, because accumulated retained earnings is the current accumulated retained earnings plus the addition to retained earnings. And the current number is here, but we cannot use this number, additional retained earnings, from the current income statement, because now this number is from the current income statement. What we need is the pro forma income statement. So the sales, this has to be the projected sales, projected cost, and all numbers have to be projected. But this is easy to do because all the numbers, all the items on the income statement are proportional to sales. So that includes the additional to retained earnings. So once we change the sales to be the projected sales, we can also figure out the projected addition to retained earnings. And then we add the current accumulated retained earnings by this projected addition to retained earnings, and then we can get the projected accumulated retained earnings from on the pro forma balance sheet. So that's the whole process to get all the numbers. So now let's start from current assets. As we said, this is proportional to sales. So we can easily figure out this number. So start from the current assets, and this is proportional to sales. So we can use the current assets from the current income balance sheet and divide that by sales to figure out the percentage. And then that percentage doesn't change, right? And then we multiply by the projected sales, and to figure out the projected current assets, and then times 1 plus the growth rate. So this $31,300,000 times 1 plus the 25%, that's the projected sales. And then we can just so this current assets projected under the pro forma balance sheet is this number, 9,121,12,500. So just put that number here, 9,125,100. Okay, go on. Fixed assets, that's also similarly down because that's also proportional to sales. So we can use the fixed assets from the current balance sheet and divide our number by sales. That's the percentage. That percentage doesn't change. And then times the new sales. New sales is simply this current sales times 1 plus the growth rate. So the fixed assets is 23,752,500. 23,752,500. And then that gives us the total assets, which is simply the sum of these two. So let me put it a little bit below because later on we're going to have a lot of more items on the right hand side of the balance sheet. Just try to keep them on the same horizontal line. Equals current assets plus fixed assets. So that gives me 32,865,000. That's the total assets. And short-term debt, that's on the right-hand side. Short-term debt, that's also similarly down because this item is also proportional to sales. And this is what the spontaneous liabilities mean. Again, find the number on the current balance sheet for the short-term debt. Copy that number and paste it. Get rid of the comma. And then divide that by sales. And then times the projected sales. Again, that's the current sales times 1 plus the growth rate. Okay, so just 8,607,500. 8,607,500. Okay, so long-term debt. as we said, we just put down the current number because we don't know what happens to this number. Just put down the current number. But we need to get rid of the comma. And common stock, similarly, just put the current number. Without the information about the financial policy of the firm, we don't know what happens to these two numbers. So just put this current number. And accumulated retained earnings. This number we cannot do as we did for these two values, because this number we can figure out. We can figure out this number. We can figure out by the current accumulated retained earnings and plus the projected addition to retained earnings. So again, we cannot directly use the number here. We have to use the pro forma income statement. And pro forma income statement is based on the projected sales rather than the current sales. But as we said, every number on the income statement is in proportion to sales. So we can actually use, so let me write number here, addition or long-term debt. Just put the current number, copy the current number here. Later on, we're gonna common stock. Just copy the current number here, and the projected addition to retained earnings. How do we calculate this number? We can just calculate it based on the similar to current asset, how we calculate the projected current assets, projected fixed assets, and projected short-term debt. Because all these numbers are proportional to sales. And additional retained earnings also is proportional to sales, because every number on the income statement is proportional to sales, as long as the dividend payout ratio remains the same. And that's assumption made in general. So can you just use the current addition to retained earnings equals current divided by current sales, and then times current sales 1 plus the growth rate. So projected right here. So now we can get the accumulated retained earnings, which is the sum of the current accumulated retained earnings plus this projected addition to retained earnings. So 13,889,706. 13,889,706. So that gives us the total equity, which is the sum of the common stock plus accumulated retained earnings. So now total liabilities plus total equity, which is simply the short-term debt plus long-term debt plus total equity. So the short-term debt plus long-term debt, that's the total liabilities. So that's the total liability, and then plus the total equity. So that gives me 30 million. 30 million. 667 206. And this total equity 176 777 066. Okay, so seems that we are done with this part. So let me check my work. Great. Okay, go on. Calculate the external funds needed. We did that calculation in part A. Why the questions ask you this number again? Because it wants you to use two different ways to figure out the same answer. Part A is based on the equation, but part B-2, it wants you to use this pro forma balance sheet to figure out the external funds needed. That's basically the difference between the total assets and the total liabilities and equity. So in general, we know that balance sheet means that these two numbers have to match with each other. But in this case, you can see they do not equal to each other. Why? Because, as we said, we haven't considered the change in the long-term debt or the common stock yet. That's because in order to maintain this growth rate of sales, the current long-term debt level and current stock level simply doesn't work, right? Because that makes the balance sheet not balanced anymore. So that means the firm has to issue some new financing, some new funds in order to get more funds. So that's called external funds needed. And that's simply the difference between the total assets and the total liabilities and the equity. So we just do the EFN. That's the difference minus this 97794. Okay, so as long as it matches the number, so we don't have to check my work again because we know that has to be right. So finally, part C, calculate the sustainable growth rate for the company based on the current financial statements. So again, find the formula for that on my PowerPoint lecture slides. The sustainable growth rate is simply the ROE, that's the return on equity, and this is defined to be net income divided by total equity, right? Times B. B here is the and B is the profit retention ratio. So that's like the after paying the dividend, how much of the earnings is remained inside the firm, is retained inside the firm. So this profit retention ratio is simply that part of the earnings that's retained inside the firm divided by the net income. So in other words, it's simply 1 minus that dividend payout ratio. And in our case, going back to the question, it's simply the addition to retained earnings number divided by the net income. So that's basically what this B here means. And then divided by 1 minus ROE times B. So that's the sustainable growth rate. As long as we know how to get every input for that equation, we can just calculate this number, sustainable growth rate. So G is GS. That equals ROE. ROE is net income divided by the total equity. And so that's the denominator. And the numerator is, sorry, that's the numerator, and the denominator is 1 minus that number. So it's we need to use the parentheses, otherwise the order will change, the priority will change. So 1 minus that number. Oh, we're not done yet. Sorry. It's R. This is so far just ROE. We haven't figured out B yet. So B is the profit retention ratio. So profit retention is simply the addition to the retained earnings divided by net income divided by net income. Okay, so now we can go to the denominator. Just copy this whole block. That's simply RE times B. So you can see that with Excel, you can do this pretty more straightforwardly than if you do that in a paper sheet. So the sustainable growth rate is this. We have to be mindful about the rounding requirement. Enter. Oh, that's another benefit of using Excel. Do not, because the rounding requirement requires you to not round intermediate calculations. So if you do that in a paper, it's very hard. It can make your calculation make your writing very messy. But with Excel, you can easily do that. You can easily follow this requirement. Enter your answer as a percent. So the percent sign is already here. Round it to 2 decimal places. So we need to change this format. So just click here, click the number, right click your mouse, and format cells. Change this to be category to be percentage, and then keep 2 decimal places. So this is already 2, and okay. So this number is what we are looking for, 16.46. So check my work. Okay, great. So we have done all these parts correctly.